All righty. I want to welcome everyone. Everyone's kind of joining in as participants right now. I'm Stephen Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, better known as PAR. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan state research and watchdog group. As part of our monthly webinar, today we're going to be looking at the 4 constitutional amendments that will be on the March 29th ballot. I think we have a lot to talk about. We have a great crew. I want to particularly thank our sponsor, the Louisiana Independent Pharmacies Association, your local community pharmacies. I really appreciate the support. That's how we get able to do things like this. And I think today they were particularly proud. We have a great webinar and a great set of guests. If we have a gang of regulars, it's these guys, and always enjoy talking with them. So we have in order Barry Erwin, who is the Chief Policy Officer of the newly formed Leaders for a Better Louisiana. I think you always want to go by Better Louisiana as sort of the short label. We have Daniel Erspamer with the CEO of the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, who focuses on the benefits of individual liberty and free enterprise. And Jan Moller, the Executive Director of Invest Louisiana, who work on public policy with a focus on how it affects low and moderate income families. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Oh, great to be here again. See everybody.
Yeah. And always we have Melinda DeLotte, who will try and keep us in line. The format will be mostly like we do. We're going to change it up a little bit. I'm going to provide for each amendment a very brief summary. I'm going to leave stuff out. Note I'm in physical pain, but we have a lot to cover. And so if you want more details, you can look at our guides or any of the other guides that the organizations here or anyone else put out. And then I'm going to turn it over to Melinda. A couple of things, we're going to go a little out of order. We're going to cover amendments 1, 3, and 4 first because they are judicial amendments, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time on Article 7 on fiscal policy. And even that one will break up into a couple of different categories. Make sure you get your questions in early because, well, I'm guessing we're going to have a pretty full, stack of questions that are come in. Particularly if you have judicial questions, put those in sooner because I think once we leave judicial, we probably are not coming back. We'll be sucked into a fiscal policy. We already have one coming in, so I'm happy about that. So with that, why don't we go a little out of order? And Daniel, do you want to bring up the First Amendment? I'll start talking about it before you can bring up. We're going to pull up the language. But this deals with creating specialty courts. So it does 2 things. It sort of restates the Supreme Court's ability and puts in the Constitution to discipline out-of-state lawyers. And it also allows for specialty courts. Now, we can have specialty courts already, but they're limited to either the judicial district or the parish. This would allow regional or statewide courts. And I think there was some discussion of maybe like a business court, but it could be other things besides that. So that's a very high level overview, but why don't we start here? What do y'all think of this one?
Okay, so I guess this is where I start stepping in
Exactly.
and saying at this point, we have 1 supporter and 2 opponents of this this amendment. So
well, we don't have any positions yet, so
okay.
So let's go no further on that one.
Okay. So, Daniel, we're gonna start with you since I know you, your organization is in support of the amendment. Can you tell us why you think voters should be supportive?
Absolutely, and again, thanks to PAR and the PAR sponsors for putting this on and making it possible. I was noticing the headshot. I guess I probably sent to you, but I had a lot darker hair in that, and that was making me wistful. Probably it's these constitutional amendments that have made made my hair turn gray and my forehead bigger. But back to the issue at hand. We love this amendment for a few reasons. The most important one, of course, is the specialty courts, and we have just seen such value in the existing specialty courts that have been created: drug courts, reentry courts, veterans courts. These are certainly, have for the most part bipartisan, cross-ideological support for these, and the ability to allow the legislature more flexibility in creating them. And as you said, Stephen, the ability for those to cross parish lines and serve communities better without having to create a whole lot of new courts, one for every jurisdiction, et cetera. So this will provide a better justice system, a fairer justice system, and allow Louisiana to see some of the same innovations that other states are doing and that we have some experience with. The disciplinary part of this, I think, is also important. The Supreme Court, of course, has responsibility for maintaining the discipline of attorneys. We see, and I thought the PAR guide chronicles this well, some of the challenges that spurred a conversation around this of out-of-state attorneys who behaved badly or potentially behaved badly. So I think this is one of those that puts power in the right places, which is what we like in terms of constitutional change, and we think it's an important one for voters to embrace.
Okay, a couple notes. I will just say the Supreme Court in its rules already has authority that it claims over out-of-state lawyers. This would just sort of codify it into the Constitution. And then the other thing, I guess, just to be real clear about the specialty courts provision, they currently can already set up specialty courts by judicial district or parish level, but this would give them the ability to expand that sort of regionally or statewide. And we have a question already about, was there a fiscal note attached to this, and do we have any idea how much it would cost? And I will just say that the fiscal note, I'm not even sure there was a fiscal note, but during the debate, what the discussion was, is there was no way to determine if it would have any cost, because this just gives them the authority as the legislature to create these courts, but it doesn't actually create any court. So with those caveats, I'm going to move to Jan and say, I know you have taken a position of opposition to this. So can you explain a little bit where y'all stand?
Sure. And let me just be clear, like, this was not an issue that we've been really working hard. We didn't testify on this in committee, but I think that the concern is really about the potential to shift power away from local jurisdictions and move that power to Baton Rouge. I think what this amendment allows, in theory, let's talk about business courts. Another way to think about this is it would allow the governor and his legislative allies to, say, create an oil and gas court in Baton Rouge, and to put their friends of the oil and gas industry potentially on that court to look at cases, which I think, creates the danger that you could be taking that power away from local judges, local districts. So there's nothing wrong with specialty courts and the system we have right now. Drug courts have been great. Reentry courts at the local level are a good thing. The concern about this is that it gives a lot of power to the state legislature to take power away from judicial districts where the political sentiment might be different than what it is in Baton Rouge. I'm thinking specifically of New Orleans or coastal parishes that might have a different view on business issues or might take a different view on such litigation than the governor's office. So this is really, I think, an attempt to take power away from judicial districts and areas of the state that have a different prevailing politics. And that's our concern.
Okay, Barry, so y'all have taken no position on this. So can you talk through, or maybe you can answer this question. We have somebody who has sent in a question asking about, doesn't this sort of potential for specialized courts in a consolidated area make it easier to influence the judges in some way? Is this the potential for corruption an issue in your mind here? So maybe go with that.
I don't know that I have thoughts on that per se. I mean, one of the things that you hear sometimes in some of the debate is that when you get really specialized courts, and I don't think they're talking so much about juvenile court and family court, but maybe if you get into some of these other areas, one, you do get people and judges with particular expertise over time, I guess, presumably in those areas. But sometimes because they don't hear other cases, they're just in that one area that they may, develop biases in those areas. Now, that's just one of the concerns that are raised. I mean, obviously, we do have courts, juvenile courts, family courts, drug courts that are of this specialty nature, and they're very well received, I think, in most places. But that is one of the criticisms that you hear, or at least concerns occasionally raised about these. And I'm thinking they're probably talking about more when you get into business courts or some of these things that maybe like Jan was talking about.
We do have a question from someone who's watching asking about the fact that there have already been multiple studies that show Louisiana per capita has more judges than many other states, particularly in the South. Are there any concerns from any of you about adding more judges by doing this, by creating these additional specialty courts? I'm just going to go with Daniel because you're shaking your head.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. This is a significant challenge of the state. We have, as noted, more judges per capita. We, in particular, have more appellate level judges. I think the thing to take away of this opportunity for specialty courts, in some cases, it may not be adding a new judge with new staffs. It may be just moving some people from different circuits around into one court. It could be adding new. This, however, should be seen, and we would argue, in the context of broader reform of the judicial system. We certainly have, over the years, called for more transparency on the spending and budget side of the courts, and to look at opportunities to certainly redistrict, but also to streamline. You know, we have elected judges in this state. So the concerns about special interests or this or that, that's already a factor that's baked into this, and there's no perfect way to construct a judiciary. But what we hope this leads to actually is far more streamlining. If you can pull out specialty issues into a court, it frees up the docket for other opportunities and other judges. So we see this in the context of broader change in the judicial system, and hope that it doesn't stop here. If the answer is only we're going to add judges but not tackle some of the other issues, that wouldn't be a great outcome. We still would support this because of our support for specialty courts. But we believe this is actually, at the end of the day, a better streamlining and more efficient way to run the court system.
Just to be clear, even in specialty courts, there would still be elected judges, not appointed judges.
Absolutely. Yep.
As required by the Constitution.
Exactly.
Somebody's asking about if the Supreme Court already has the authority to discipline out-of-state lawyers. What does this change? Essentially, they have written the ability to discipline out-of-state lawyers into their rules and their code of conduct for attorneys. This would put that same provision in the Constitution. I'm not sure if there was some question about whether their authority really existed. I have not heard any questions about whether or not they already have this existing authority. This just places it in the Constitution to make sure it's clarified. And then we have one question about, can this type of court get around courts that have, according to this person, have had problems holding criminals accountable, particularly in New Orleans? Jan, I think that's one of the concerns, is that this might take authority away from courts where people don't like the outcomes. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely. And I think, look, we don't know what the legislature is going to do with this power if the voters give them this power, but I think it's inevitable that they're going to create more government in the form of more courts, more people to administer those courts, more costs that the citizens are going to have to bear for those courts. But really the goal here, I think, is to take power away from locally elected district and appellate judges and hand that power to new courts that they would create on specific issues, whether it's to hear certain types of litigation, business courts, whatever. Yes, this legislation can get very complex, but I think again, New Orleans, I think, is the example that people bring up, because I think there is a fear that the legislature, which often has a different ideology than the public and the elected officials in New Orleans, would take some of that power away and put it in Baton Rouge, and move certain types of lawsuits to this new layer of government that they want to create.
Let's just, for the record here, note that Jan is against growing the state government. This is being recorded, Jan. We'll hold you to this.
I think his caveat is he might be against it in this particular fashion.
I was glad to hear Daniel speak up for more layers of government and bureaucracy.
Yeah, that was rough.
I hope Elon Musk isn't listening here. But
streamlining. This is what we're trying to get: more efficient, more effective. And I'll just note, there remain checks and balances within the court system. certainly that could be, I hear Jan's concern, that could be a concern. When there are bad actors in the system or bad outcomes, that's why we have other layers of the court system to police that. So that exists today. This is not creating a new threat to good jurisprudence. This just allows for some streamlining and specialization within the court system that, again, we believe will actually yield to better, more efficient, and smaller court system at the end of the day, not overnight.
I love that Barry is Switzerland here. I also love that we have such wonky people watching that they're excited about all of the
Terrific.
amendments and have a lot of questions. But we probably need to move on to Amendment 3. Like Stephen said, we're going to take them out of order, so we're going to go next to Amendment 3.
All right, there's I think already been a lot of discussion about this from various groups. This is the changes what's in the Constitution to allow for prosecution of someone under 17 or a juvenile as an adult. So right now, if you're 17, you can already be charged as an adult. This would affect if you're under that age. And there are 16 crimes listed in the Constitution that then can be, not necessarily would be, but can be charged as an adult and prosecuted as an adult. This would take those that list out of the Constitution, and then it would essentially give the legislature the power to add or remove additional crimes from that list with a 2/3 vote. So essentially removing it from the Constitution, giving the legislature more flexibility. I think that the idea is that it probably most people are concerned that it would add crimes, but we don't really have a clear list of what that might be.
Okay, and I'll just note here that 17-year-olds in Louisiana are considered adults when they are arrested for any criminal offenses. And currently, under state law, Louisiana allows teenagers from ages 14 to 16 to be treated as adults for the purposes of this amendment. Now, obviously, they could go in law and change that age, but currently we're talking about teenagers from ages 14 to 16. So Barry, since you were a little quiet in the last one, I'm just going to start with you. Have y'all taken a position on this Amendment 3?
Not yet. I hope we will have that out shortly. But, I think it is a big amendment and one that people ought to pay attention to. I mean, just kind of in the historical sense, several years ago when we did some of the criminal justice reforms, we kind of had rolled that back to, protect, the 17-year-old down so that they weren't tried as adults in most cases. Then we kind of moved it back up. I think the issue is the very serious crimes that are already enumerated in the Constitution are already in statute. So that part will stay. And then the question is, and that was part of the discussion during the testimony, like which other crimes might be added to this for, those 16, 15, and 14-year-old kids to be tried as adults. And we heard things like carjacking. We heard things like drive-by shootings. We heard things like fentanyl distribution. And honestly, some of those things, one would argue, are probably already covered to a large extent in what's in here. I mean, I think the question is for voters is right now to add to the list, voters have to decide if they want to do that or not, the public. Or if this passes, then the legislature would be able to decide. So that's kind of the, nuts and bolts of what the question is for voters.
Okay, Daniel, have y'all taken a position at Pelican on this amendment?
We haven't, but I'll share some of our thinking on it. On one hand, from a constitutional reform principle, taking out the policy questions there, we would agree with this. We think these decisions are best made by the legislature. This is one of those things we would argue probably doesn't belong in the Constitution, that level of specificity of law that belongs in statute. So from that perspective, I think, again, as a constitutional reform principle, perfectly good and fine. We do share some concerns about what happens after that. Obviously, we have engaged in criminal justice and public safety reform conversations over the years, and we have some concerns about the data being used to make some of these decisions. But that's a fight largely that should take place in the legislature, not at the ballot box, and we'll have the opportunity to do that should this pass. So we have some concerns. Obviously, And we did not engage in this in the legislature, so we have not taken a formal position.
And I think some of the arguments for this are obviously that, the types and severity of crimes over the years have changed in Louisiana since this list was developed, and the legislature should get more authority to determine and respond to public safety concerns that their constituents have. Jan, I know y'all have taken a position in opposition to this. Can you walk through your concerns?
Well, thanks, Melinda. I'm still trying to understand what problem the legislature is trying to solve with this, because even the sponsor of this bill couldn't really outline a specific crime that is not currently covered, that the legislature somehow wants the ability to send 14-year-old children to jail. And let's talk about what this actually is doing. It expands the legislature's ability to send 14-year-old children to jail as adults. When you're 14 years old, society deems that you cannot drive a car, that you cannot vote, that you can't serve in the military. You're not even allowed to go to an R-rated movie, because science and society understands that you don't have the potential to make adult choices as a 14-year-old child. But we now want to give the Louisiana legislature more power to decide that these children who may commit a crime, but again, they're children, should be treated as adults for the purposes of the criminal justice system. This is, it's grotesque that we're even talking about this, that it's on the ballot. We should be talking about more ways to treat children like children, and not more ways to send them to throw their lives away by treating them as adults. We have a juvenile justice system in this country and in the state because children have more capacity for rehabilitation. Children make bad choices, but they can be rehabilitated. Our brains aren't really fully formed as adults until we reach our mid-20s. Nobody's talking about having these laws apply to people who are 24 years old, but 14, 15, and 16-year-old children should be treated as children. We shouldn't be expanding the power of the legislature to throw their lives away.
Let me just put in real quickly. When Melinda or I ask a question, we might be playing devil's advocate. No one to try to infer what Parr's position is based on the questions that Melinda asked, because we're repeating a lot of stuff that may be questions that are asked in chat, for example. So go ahead, Melinda.
Right. All right. No, thank you for that clarification. Parr has taken no position on any of these amendments, but when everybody sort of seems like they have the same areas of concern, I'm just trying to provide the other perspective so people get a well-rounded discussion. One of the questions we have, and I think I can answer this, is, isn't it always at the discretion of the prosecutor? And this is something I had to learn in writing about this. So essentially the way we have it now, teenagers who are 15 or 16 are prosecuted as adults if they're accused of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, aggravated rape, or aggravated kidnapping. The district attorneys decide on a case-by-case basis if they want to prosecute teenagers who are 15 and 16 as an adult for the remaining list of the crimes that are in the Constitution. If it involves a 14-year-old, that is when a judge has to get involved and determine if they want to transfer them to the adult system. Usually, my understanding is they do that in consultation with the DA. But that's sort of the landscape of how that works. So it's not always at the discretion of the prosecutor. One of the questions we have about this one is, is this common for states to have such a list in their constitutions? And I know during the debate over this, there was a lot of discussion about Louisiana is very rare in this, but I don't know that anybody's actually done a survey of other states in this. Daniel, do you know if there's been a survey of any kind?
I don't. That's a great question. My suspicion is we are, as in many things with our Constitution, a significant outlier in this, but I have not surveyed the other state constitutions to find out.
That was a good question.
Yeah.
Right. And I do have this moment that I just want to ask Jan. A lot of times we say if Louisiana does something unique to Louisiana, usually that's not always a good thing. So do you have any response to, is it, does that change your perspective in any way that we might be an outlier in how we handle this?
I don't know if we're an outlier, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I certainly would not be opposed to having fewer crimes enumerated in the Constitution that children could be sent to adult jail for.
Okay. Barry, anything else you want to add before we move on to Amendment 4?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay, Stephen, take it away. We're on Amendment 4.
All right, Amendment number 4. This changes the mechanism and how long we have to appoint have a special election for really the Supreme Court. So this comes about because there was, you have to appoint and have into office within 12 months if the Supreme Court vacancy, some exceptions. But the other part is also we changed how we do our primaries. For certain types of races, you have a closed primary system now, which added a runoff in the party primaries. You have the party primary, then you have a runoff, and then you have the general election, which will have both parties plus third parties as well. So that added another election. And also to try and save costs, they tried to make sure they put those elections on statewide ballots. So congressional election, governor's election, legislative seats. So those two things can't both happen all the time as it is right now. It's very possible. That depends on when someone resigns. Under the current system, they wouldn't be able to fit for a Supreme Court seat and get someone in there in 12 months. So this actually changes that so that they have to try and do it in 12 months if possible. If not, they can have longer than that. There are a lot of little details in both the primary law change and also this, but I think that's the overall take on this one.
And I'll just say here that the closed primary system starts in 2026, so it hasn't happened yet, and it only affects elections for Congress, the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Public Service Commission, and then obviously the Supreme Court. And so because of that provision in the Constitution with judges specifically, that's why it affects the Supreme Court and pretty much no one else. So with that caveat, Barry, I'm going to start with you. Have y'all taken a position on this one?
No, but we soon will. I will tell you, we soon will. So we'll have it out. But I mean, I think Stephen did a pretty good job. It's pretty much kind of a technical thing to bring, the desire of the way we hold elections and keep the costs down with those, already kind of called statewide elections, to conform to what the Constitution requires, that basically these elections have to be filled or whatever within 12 months. So it kind of takes that part of it out. I will say, and this is just observation, but I'll throw it out for food for thought. It was interesting to me that when this bill was filed, it also included something in there about those specialty courts that we were talking about earlier, with appointments to those courts if there's a vacancy, which is kind of what we talked about before. But what we didn't say is that when there's a vacancy and it's done like that right now, the person that is chosen, for that temporary position cannot run for that office. But there was an attempt to do that with those specialty courts in this case. So I don't know. I just throw that out as an observation. A lot of interest apparently in specialty courts and who gets appointed to them.
Just to be clear, that provision though was removed before it made it to the ballot. So that's not what anybody's voting for. They're voting on this technical change and whether they want to do it this way.
That's correct. But when it started, there were 2 points to this bill, kind of like the way that other one was.
And I guess the crux of it is you could either change the law to allow more elections to happen to fill these judgeships in the 12-month timeline specified in the Constitution, or you could change the Constitution. So Daniel, I believe Pelican is in favor of this change. Can you walk us through why you think the Constitution should be changed instead of the law?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think, we've supported it. It's a relatively common sense approach. I think it's a fair question. Does this belong in the Constitution or should the law be changed? The law is what it is for now, and this will ultimately give more flexibility down the road. And this is, for better or for worse, where we capture the broad guardrails of the election law. So we're in favor of it. We see it as primarily a technical change to conform with, to allow this to be more efficient and effective. And, the future legislatures may choose to reverse course on primaries or, however that looks. This will still allow that flexibility in the long run.
And not shockingly, Jan has a different perspective than Daniel. So Jan, can you walk us through why investors opposed to this amendment?
Well, I think this first of all, this is not something that we've really worked on, or we have a major dog in this fight at all. I think the easy answer to this problem is to not have party primaries. I think one of the things Louisiana does really well and has done really well for a half a century is the open primary system. I don't see why it needed to be changed, but and that's the reason we're having this conversation at all. I think if we have a concern about this, it's really that it's going to create more important elections on low turnout dates. And we're going to talk about low turnout dates when we get to Amendment 2 in a second. But I think that is that's the crux of our concerns. But again, this is not something that we're spending a lot of time or mental energy on.
We have a question from someone asking, do you think the purpose of this amendment is to prevent candidates for judge from aging out because the constitutional provision requires that after age 70, a judge can't run for re-election. Is that something that y'all think is involved, any one of the three of you? I mean, I haven't heard that discussed, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I never heard it discussed. I don't think it was part of the testimony or any of that. I do feel like they just felt like this was an issue, and the Secretary of State was kind of there talking about it from the elections point of view. So, it seemed more like a technical fix, from the way at least the discussion went.
I got head shakes from Daniel and Jan, so I think y'all didn't think it had anything to do with judges aging out as well. Okay, great. Now we're done with 3 of the 4, and we have about a half an hour to go over a complete rewrite of the budget and tax section of the Constitution. Everybody get excited and hold on. Stephen,
Yeah.
start explaining this.
I don't know why I'm explaining this. I think I lost like a coin flip or something, so I'm not sure. I guess Melinda had to actually write the draft, so it's the least I can do. All right, so why don't we pull up? We're going to talk about Article the 7. This is the Second Amendment. This is rewrites Article 7. One overview. There are 3 ways to change our Constitution. You can have a regular amendment, and that's the first 3 amendments we talked about, sort of your basic amendment that most people see on the ballot. You can have a constitutional convention is another way to do it. And in that process, you could rewrite the entire Constitution. But there's also a third way, which is you can actually just rewrite one article of the Constitution. And that's what this is doing. That's why it's so much more comprehensive than some of the other things we've talked about. So to give an overview, we've broken it down in sort of 6 different groupings, trying to just make it easier to digest to people. So Alex, do we have that? Yeah. So we have a general taxing authority. This is kind of more a grab bag of tax things that are put together. We have a government growth limit that is part of the Constitution. We have the merger of state savings accounts. It's the rainy day fund. Then the trust fund use to teacher pay. We'll definitely talk about that and how that whole mechanism works. Then there's some other fund changes, things that are going to move out of the Constitution and get special protections, but still be moved out. And then property taxes. And property taxes actually has a lot in there as well. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the General Taxing Authority. I'll give a high-level overview. One of the questions that we got in the chat was, how is this going to affect the taxpayer? Probably the biggest thing, because a lot of stuff you won't notice immediately. It either gives the legislature the ability to change things, or they're going to be funds changes that really more affect state government spending, but not so much people's pocketbook. This is not, this is not really change or affect, either for better or worse, all of the tax reforms that we already had. This is really a lot of separate things. So one thing it does is if you're over 65, it would double your standard deduction. That's probably the thing that most directly impacts people, though there are other things as well. But that's probably the simplest to explain anyway. It maintains the big 3 sales tax exemptions: groceries, residential utilities, and prescription drugs. It puts in a prohibition against new sales tax exemptions unless they also cover the state. So the state and local exemptions for sales tax have to be one and the same. So you don't have this splintering of the system. For new tax exemptions, it requires a 2/3 vote, which is different than the current law. Now you can add a new tax exemption with a majority vote. You can still lower the tax rate with a majority vote, though. So there's a concern over the the expansion of so many exemptions in the Constitution, and this is an idea to sort of lower that. The maximum tax rate in the Constitution comes down. It doesn't actually affect the current tax rate. Removing some things from the Constitution, like the cigarette tax, it's still going to be there, but it's not going to be in the Constitution. And it's also giving a lot more flexibility to the legislature in terms of severance tax. So it's going to remove the caps that are in the Constitution and also give the legislature to sort of give more money to the locals. And that's the intent here, I think, is to try and have additional sharing between those two levels of government. So that is a very high level overview of sort of a grab bag of things done with taxes at the state level.
And so I'll just start before I launch into making other people talk about this. Is the reason this is so complicated is it's a 115-page bill. Plus it has 4 or 5 companion bills to move things to statute and explain the mechanisms of how this would work. So that is why it is so tricky to discuss. So I guess before we go into any more detail about specific things, if you want to talk through sort of your perspective broadly on what it does to the general taxing authority and those kind of things. I'm going to start with Daniel this time because I've had Barry do this twice and I feel bad.
No, she doesn't.
Yeah, we're enthusiastic in our support for this, as you know, and others have talked at length about the need to streamline the Constitution, to find the appropriate place for what should be in the Constitution, what should be in statute. It doesn't get everything perfect, but this is a dramatic improvement from the current structure. So in general taxing authority, obviously we want the maximum income tax rate in the Constitution to be as low as possible. We fully agree with the 2/3 vote requirement to add new exemptions. We have a fundamental belief that tax policy should be low, flat, broad, and fair. And when you exempt one person or group of people, it means to collect the same amount of revenue to fund government, you have to raise taxes on someone else. And so we believe everyone should have skin in the game, and it should be as fair and flat and simple as possible. Those are the sort of the 2 highlights. I think the progress in state and local working together. One of the huge challenges of our state is the complexity, particularly of the sales tax system and different rates and bases across the board. This begins the process of aligning those and simplifying them. I think that's a great thing, and we hope to see more of it.
Hey, and I saw a question that Stephen answered, but I think it's a good one to just let everybody know, because I suspect it can be very confusing because this happened in a tax special session where other things were changed in our tax system. So if this amendment passes or fails, that has no impact on the income tax changes that have already happened, the sales tax changes that have already happened. All of that stays on the books, no matter the outcome of constitutional amendment number 2. I just wanted to clarify that. Barry, have y'all taken a position on amendment 2? And if so, what will it be?
This one we did. So yeah, no, we support it. Much to the same way Daniel had talked about. I mean, to be honest, when you're rewriting, as you mentioned, such a large part of the Constitution, that is a monumental undertaking. And there are a lot of pieces and parts to it, as we are about to uncover here as we go forward. So there are things, obviously that we still have some concerns about. We wish they'd have been done a little bit differently, but there are a lot of things that I think actually make good sense, or really a lot of them are the same types of things that we have all been talking about for a long time. And that really, that y'all had kind of put in your kind of framework for a new constitution, at least dealing with a lot of these portions of this. So we are supportive of it. I think to the point you're talking about on the taxation side, or at least this first part that we're talking about, I think by and large, these are all really good things that we're doing. We're maintaining some things in the Constitution that the public would want to see in there: food, drugs, and utilities, sales tax. We're changing the income tax rate, which I'm sure people would like to see that go down. So that's in there. You can argue whether, a cap should be in the Constitution or not, but it's there. But on these other things, that they're actually fiscal policy reforms, I think, that make it better in terms of passing more exemptions, or trying to get, eventually our sales tax basis, state and local, somewhat more uniform than they are. So, I mean, I think there's kind of hard to argue anything too negative about this section that we're talking about right now.
I think Jan will disagree with you. My understanding is that Invest in Louisiana has strong opinions about Amendment 2, and they are in opposition. And I know we'll get into the weeds of it, but Jan, just broadly, can you talk through sort of what some of the high-level concerns are with Amendment 2?
Well, this is really a case. We have two main objections to this very long, very complex amendment, and it's bad process, which got us to bad policy outcomes. So let's start briefly with the process, because it was about a year ago when Governor Landry surprised a lot of people by saying a constitutional convention would be his top priority in his first regular session of the legislature. And Daniel and his friends had been kind enough to draft a constitution, and the governor's plan was to have this done in 2 weeks at the end of the regular session, a constitutional convention. And not, mind you, the last time a constitutional rewrite of this magnitude was undertaken, it was a 2-year process. And when we were asked, when the governor was asked, well, why do you need to do this in 2 weeks at the end of the regular sessions? Well, because we want the people to vote on this on November 6th, because that is the highest turnout election that we have every 4 years. Well, the legislature said no to a constitutional convention. The governor tried again to get one done at the end of summer. The legislature again said no. And so instead of doing a constitutional convention, they did this wholesale constitutional rewrite during 20 days, right after the November 6th election, right before Thanksgiving, when most people weren't paying attention. And what resulted was this 109-page constitutional amendment that makes the Constitution bigger in a lot of ways and more restrictive. And they put it on a very low turnout date. So that's the process. And I think the process is flawed because, again, the last time the legislature undertook something of this magnitude, it took 2 years, and they elected delegates, and they spent an entire year debating this. And so I want to congratulate PAR, because Melinda, I think you did the best job that I've seen of boiling down what is actually in this amendment and what we're voting on. Some of our high-level concerns about the policy is we don't need to have a constitutional cap on personal income taxes, because, frankly, we don't know what the needs of this state are going to be in 10 or 20 years. We don't know what kind of revenue the state is going to need to raise. Take, for example, the fact that Washington is actively debating. In fact, today they're going to debate whether to cut almost $1 trillion out of the Medicaid program. That could have enormous implications on Louisiana and might lead Louisiana to rethink, maybe we need to raise more revenue. The Constitution would restrict that. It puts a 2/3 supermajority requirement on enacting new tax credits. One of the few tools we have in our tax system for helping people with low and moderate incomes is the earned income tax credit. And that has been able to, had bipartisan support in the legislature going back almost 20 years. And now if the legislature wanted to expand that or create something like a child tax credit, they would be barred from doing that. So, and we're going to get to the government growth limit in a minute. But so this is a case, broadly speaking, of the legislature doing in a very rushed process without much public scrutiny what should have been done in a much more public, drawn-out debate, and put before the voters at a time when more people are paying attention.
Okay, I think I was right that Jan has strong opinions about this one. So I'm going to answer a question we got just to quickly get this one out of the way. Somebody was asking what's happening with the MFP and does this affect the MFP? And I'll just say the MFP is in Article 8, which is the education section of the Constitution. So this doesn't have any changes made to the MFP or any effect on the MFP in that regard. So now we'll move on and start diving into details and move on to the government growth limit. Stephen, feel free to explain that.
Sure. So the government growth limit, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm going to let Daniel talk about it a little bit. We have an expenditure limit in the Constitution, so you can't spend over a certain amount, and that changes each year. So this will add a growth limit that should be less than that. You can spend if you're over the growth limit, but you can only spend on non-recurring items. Although that's not necessarily clear what the definition is from what we've heard. So that's real high level. I'll let Daniel, since Daniel, you had a hand in crafting this. Am I wrong?
Well, it's certainly been a policy that we have advocated for many years. And look, let's start with the problem. And as much as I appreciate Jan acknowledging, I do have some friends. This is the idea that there's something shady or behind the scenes. We're a public policy think tank. Of course, we're going to produce research recommendations. And my experience, and I suspect Jan and Barry have this too, is elected officials, like most human beings, like something to look at and respond to. So of course we have an opinion. Of course we produce something. The idea that there was some shenanigans or something happening behind the scenes is just absurd. But let's get into the government growth limit. The state budget has grown, this is including all funds, 88% over the last decade. I suspect most of the viewers on this webinar have not seen their personal household budgets or small business budgets grow 88% over the last decade. And even when you take it down to the state general fund, we're talking over 30% growth. This is all at the same time when inflation, other than in the last few years, was flat during a lot of that time, and our population was declining. And so what we believe, something like a government growth limit and what's put here, is a reasonable, rational way to make sure government doesn't grow faster than taxpayers are willing and able to pay for it. And that's the position we found ourselves in. And this is a bipartisan challenge. We could expand that, not just the last 10 years, we could expand it the last 20 years. It's a similar problem. And that's because we live in a state that has big ups and big downs. And what has happened is when there's big ups in money, whether that's because of a natural disaster or an oil boom or you name it, we spend all the money that comes in. And then when the inevitable bust happens, we don't cut that spending. We don't right size back to the government the taxpayers are willing to pay for. Instead, we have traditionally raised taxes to make up the difference. So this is an attempt to get us out of that bust and boom cycle. If it works, which it will, is what it will do is ensure we have stable government, predictable government, and that is good for everyone. That is attractive to new jobs. That is attractive to entrepreneurs. It makes people's lives more predictable and government more predictable.
And let me just clarify right here, just so people can understand the way the percentage growth allowed would be calculated is a formula that involves state population changes and various inflation factors.
Correct. Yep. Thank you for that clarification. I'll just close on this. I know other people are going to have opinions, but this is again a reasonable limit. And what happens to monies that are over that limit in terms of recurring expenses or in terms of money is we get to use that for either, hopefully, some mix of further tax relief or something I think all of us can agree on, further investment in the state's roads and bridges infrastructure, which is in desperate need of attention. And there are other reforms that need to come along with that as well. But this is a win-win-win across the board. It's good for taxpayers. It's good for our infrastructure. It's good for consistency and predictability. And it's reasonable. It's not suggesting, it does allow government to grow. And as we hope to have population growth over the next decades, hopefully we reverse that trend and get in a very good place that we should be. This will add more resources to government and allow government to keep up with it. Makes sense all around.
We have a question about would the government growth limit limit federal dollars and spending coming into the state? I can answer that. That's a no. It would only affect state general fund. There's a long list of types of funds that it wouldn't apply to, including federal dollars, money that's transferred among agencies, the fees and self-generated revenue that various agencies have. So none of that is impacted by this. This is purely on the state general fund. With that, Jan, explain why you think the government growth limit is a bad idea.
Well, first, I just want to correct something Daniel said about the growth of government. And I'm looking right now in front of me, the governor's own PowerPoint that he put out with the budget. The state general fund has grown by an average of less than 3% over the past decade. So state government has been growing at the same rate as the general economy. And it's been doing that for a long time. Federal funds fluctuate up and down. We had that happen with COVID. We've had that happen after various natural disasters. But that money, again, is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the growth of general government. And over the past decade, frankly, the state has been very conservative with its dollars. When Bobby Jindal left office, there were $250 million in the state's rainy day accounts, and that number has grown 15-fold. There's almost $4 billion in state savings accounts. So the governors and the legislature have been very careful about putting money away. What this growth limit does, and the problem with that is that it says that, you know, the politics of today should be the priorities of Louisiana forevermore going forward. And it says that even if revenue is available, if Louisiana finds some way to turn swamp water into energy, and has an absolute economic boom and rising revenue, then Daniel's government growth limit would prevent Louisiana from spending that, or a future legislature might decide that they want to invest in early childhood education, something there's bipartisan support for, but we're about $1 billion short of what it would take to provide that. Or they wanted to maybe make higher education affordable for every student in the state, or some new program that maybe there isn't political support for right now, but might be in the future. But because that is a new recurring expense, we would be unable to say it. For example, and to put it in other terms, we have a new school voucher plan that was just passed last year. If that is fully enacted, that's going to add $500 million a year in new recurring spending, which might bump up against this government growth limit. So I think you're substituting the judgment of you're putting this kind of a bright line limit that says government cannot grow in recurring fashion above this line, even if the money is available. And legislators should have the ability to create new programs and change their priorities, and they'd be prevented from doing that with this.
I have to jump in. I'm sorry. We got to correct a couple of misstatements here. I know
Okay,
Barry
y'all
has some
can go
things to
back and
say.
forth a little bit, but then we got to move on at some point.
I understand. I won't belabor it. But Jan, that's just false. Let's start with the question of new programs. There is a mechanism with 2/3 of the legislature to agree to increase this. There are mechanisms to change this. Certainly, if there is some new magical money tree somewhere that you think is going to exist, this is not hamstringing the legislature from making those decisions. In fact, it provides the forum for the discussion to happen. If we're going to add $1 billion new program or take on a new initiative, as you suggest we should, that deserves a heck of a lot more debate than just a quick budget thing through the legislature as part of a whole other package of spending. So this gives the opportunity for lawmakers to actually reflect the priorities of the day and to actually be responsive to constituents and voters. And it forces that debate to happen in public. It forces that decision to add new government recurring spending and programs. It raises the level of that debate. That's a good thing for everyone. If you have an idea, it should be debated and we should discuss, is that a higher priority than something else in the budget? Or is this worthy of something? But the reality is government should not grow faster than, again, in this limit, population and inflation. That's a reasonable point of view. And it does not, as much as I'd love for this to be Daniel's growth limit, it's not.
But there's absolutely nothing right now that blocks that debate from happening. These debates happen every single year in the legislature right
Except
now.
they don't, Jan. You know, if we go back to, this is my last point, I promise. If we go back, you talked about how conservative the state has been. That's all well and good. We're for adding to the rainy day fund. We think savings accounts and fiscal responsibility are a really important thing, but that all happened along with $1 billion plus annual tax increase. That did not happen because of fiscal restraint or responsibility. So it's just, the idea that things are all rosy and happening now. Government has grown faster than taxpayers' ability to fund it. And clearly, because of what voters have sent their representatives to do in Baton Rouge, has grown faster than they're willing to pay for it.
Okay, Jan and Daniel, y'all can schedule a time to meet outside later. But we've got to move on to the merger of state savings accounts,
Yeah,
which Stephen is going to explain quickly.
Yeah, let me explain. But let's be really clear. We're probably going to go a little over time. So those people, we understand if you have to drop off. However, we want to try and get as much of this as we can because this is going to be on our YouTube channel and other people are going to come and reference this. So completely understand you have to drop off and hopefully you can stay, or if you're not, you can catch the rest of it. So let's go with the merger of savings accounts. This is sort of the toughest one to summarize quickly. We have two savings accounts. We have the Budget Stabilization Fund, which was really formed after the boom and bust oil system in the 80s. So we would build our budget on high oil revenues and then it would collapse and then the whole government be thrown into chaos. So we decided that in really high oil times, some portion of that would be put into the Budget Stabilization Fund, known as the Rainy Day Fund, and then we could tap it when we had shortfalls. And we've expanded that to federal disasters. Then recently we have a Revenue Stabilization Fund, which is very similar, but it really applies mostly to corporate revenue. So when there's high levels of corporate revenue, that money is put into that fund and then it can be tapped. This is a little different, really, with a 2/3 vote and someone says it's an emergency, it could be tapped for things. So it's a little less tighter on what it can be used for. This part of the amendment would essentially move the money, most of the money from the Budget Stabilization Fund, from the from the Revenue Stabilization Fund into the Budget Stabilization Fund. So it would make it one of the more well-funded rainy day funds in the country. About $1 billion would be left behind in the Revenue Stabilization Fund for a year or two, and that would be used to help pay for incentives to get rid of the inventory tax, and also if there's a shortfall in corporate revenue for the next couple of years. So it sort of works as a hedge. One thing it also does, though, and this is important, it gets rid of the funding mechanism that currently exists. So excess revenues are not put into these rainy day funds anymore. The only thing that would really exist is that if surplus revenue exists, that would go into the Budget Stabilization Fund if it's not full. And there's like a $25 million, dedication that exists only in statute. So that's a very high overview, a very complicated process, but essentially we're combining funds, funding it, though the recurring funding for us will be much less.
Okay, that was a mouthful. Barry, do you have thoughts on how these fund mergers would happen and if you think it's a good idea?
I think it's mostly a good idea. I mean, I think it does some very positive things, as Stephen mentioned it. Well, first, we're going to be increasing the cap on our rainy day fund significantly, and then we're going to put almost $2 billion in there in addition to it to get it up to that cap. I mean, that is a big deal. And as y'all have pointed out, I mean, that would give us one of the healthiest rainy day funds in the entire country. I mean, a very strong rainy day fund. It's also an interesting idea to try and use the dollars that are left over in that Revenue Stabilization Fund to try and incent local governments to get rid of an inventory tax that most all of us probably agree is, not one that's competitive for the state. Don't know how many people would take advantage or parishes would take advantage of it, but it's an incentive to do that. So I think all that is positive. I think the main downside is what was also mentioned is that, one of the reasons we created that was to try and level off of, volatile sources of revenue that we get to go up and down. Now, again, corporate is the primary one right now. This kind of gets rid of the premise of that in a way. We would have to kind of use our own, fiscal restraint to kind of take care of that. Other side of that is we probably won't be getting as much corporate revenue as we have because we've been cutting the corporate taxes. So that probably mitigates that to some degree. But I think the bottom line is it does some pretty good things. It's probably not perfect, not exactly the way we would have done it, but I do think by and large, it puts us in a good position.
Jan, thoughts about this change?
Well, I think having a healthier rainy day fund is certainly a good idea. We have some concerns that it's not going to be replenished as easily as it was in the past, and we have some concerns about getting rid of the revenue stabilization trust fund. As long as I've been in Louisiana, coming up on 22 years, we've all been complaining about the quality of our roads and our bridges and our infrastructure. All you have to do is cross the border into Texas and see what better infrastructure looks like. And the Revenue Stabilization Trust Fund was the first really long-term attempt to put money aside to address those issues. And we were doing it with excess corporate revenue. Now, we're not going to have excess corporate revenue because we cut taxes for corporations by more than half. When you talk about the franchise tax and the corporate income tax changes, mostly the franchise tax. But so you're taking a trust fund that was relatively new, but was growing at a very healthy clip and was about to start paying out and giving us a recurring source of funding for infrastructure improvements that is now going away with this vote. So there is an opportunity cost to this. And so I think that's our main concern with this, but certainly having a healthier rainy day fund is a very good idea.
So the bottom line is that all the corporate income and severance tax that was being funneled off to the Revenue Stabilization Fund will no longer go there. And so a lot of this money will just go into the state general fund. So we don't have any scenarios of what this might mean in terms of how much of an increase in the state general fund the legislature may get, but it is obvious that they will have more millions of dollars more in additional revenue to spend on however they would like to spend it in the state general fund, because it won't be going to trust funds anymore. Daniel, talk through your thoughts on this particular provision of the amendment.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I know we have a lot to get through. I agree with almost all that Barry said. I think, sorry, Jan. I think that I'll agree with something Jan said as well is, I think we all agree a healthier, more robust rainy day fund is a good thing for everyone. It's smart, it's thoughtful. Certainly, if we look at the reduction or elimination of the franchise tax, all the models that we reviewed actually show that the net result of that actually is more money into government coffers. That one returns very quickly, given the capital and jobs that have been on the sidelines because of the punishing franchise tax, a terrible tax. So I think this ends up again with probably over the next 2 to 3 years more money into the state general fund, which is again why the growth limit is so important, so that those dollars get spent on infrastructure, roads and bridges, and we keep a tight hold on our recurring spending. But the merger of these accounts, I think, is generally a good thing. And it does what the next piece of this we'll talk about as well, frees up more resources for the legislature to actually appropriate and to reflect the priorities of their constituents.
Okay, and let's move on to the one that I think is probably the most high profile piece of this amendment, the trust fund dissolution and the use of that money for teacher pay. Stephen?
Exactly. So at a real high level, there are some funds in the Constitution. They have some principle in them, and the earnings from that are used for educational support. That was about $70 million in the current year is what we're looking at in the last estimate that we have. The $2 billion from that fund, from those funds, will be taken and then used to pay down debt on the teachers' retirement system. So then local systems and higher education will have to pay less to fund their retirement system. So I think it's about a $2 billion reduction. So we're losing from about $8 billion to about $6 billion worth of debt. So that frees up a lot more ability for them to spend the money that they do have on other things. That will that move will save about $1 billion in interest. So it's $2 billion being used for a total reduction of about $3 billion. That's going to generate about $200 million in ability to spend for K-12 and about 75 for higher education. So those will free that up. However, that has to go toward in K-12 has to go for toward teacher pay. Now, there's a lot of discussion and there's already chats on whether that is a permanent teacher pay raise or it makes permanent the stipend that they're already getting. But essentially it's whatever they're getting now, but it's temporary, would become permanent if this constitutional amendment passes. There has been some discussion about there are some places they won't get the full $2,000 increase, just the way some of the numbers work. The governor said publicly that they will work to try and make sure that they can fill those gaps as well. So that is a very high level overview. Essentially, we're taking money from some education funds because the debt on teacher retirement is so much higher, that the interest rate we're borrowing is so much higher. It creates savings, and then those savings would essentially be used to then fund a teacher pay raise for the most part, although not completely.
Okay, so, and I'll just say that public school teachers for 2 years have been getting a $2,000 stipend. And school support workers for 2 years have been getting a $1,000 stipend. Those were not guaranteed to show up every year. So this is arguably designed to replace that funding and make those stipends permanent. Jan, I'm going to start with you on this one. Talk through your thoughts on how this is being structured.
Well, let's start with what's being lost here, because these two big funds that we're talking about, the 8G Fund, the Excellent Education Quality Support Fund, and the Education Excellence Fund, were funds that the voters created when Louisiana in the past received windfall revenues. The first one was for oil and gas revenues. Second one was the tobacco settlement. And the legislature at the time and the voters decided we're going to put this money in a permanent trust fund, and we're going to spend the interest out of those on education. So if this amendment passes, those funds go away, and so $70 million a year in recurring funding for education, everything from early childhood education to K-12 and higher education, that recurring funding goes away and creates a hole in the budget. And so, as you said, the money would go to ask local school boards to provide teachers with a raise. Let's be clear, teachers are not getting any more money next year than they would be getting this year. All you're doing is replacing a stipend with a raise, but it's the same amount of money. If you're getting the same amount of money, you're actually losing money because we still have inflation here in Louisiana and elsewhere. But I think our main concern with this is that it essentially takes the state out of the business of providing teacher pay raises. I've been around long enough to remember when this was something, former Governor Mike Foster refused to take a salary as governor until teachers were paid at the Southern regional average. And every year the MFP would include a 2.75% pay raise for teachers. That goal wasn't achieved until Kathleen Blanco was in office. Well, for a brief moment there, teachers were paid at the Southern regional average. And since then, it's been eroding and they've been losing more and more ground. So this, look, extra money is extra money. I wake up next to a public school teacher every morning. But our household isn't getting any more money out of this. And my bigger concern is that it basically says, hey, it's the locals who should be responsible for making sure teachers are paid. The state is getting out of that business. And I think that's a bad policy decision.
We have a question here about not every school system would get enough savings from the retirement payment to actually cover the full cost of the 2,000 and 1,000. So just to answer that, as Stephen said, the administration has promised publicly multiple times on a microphone that they would fill in the gaps, that the state would come up with the additional money for the charter schools who aren't in the retirement system and the school systems that don't get enough savings to fully cover the raises or stipends turned raises. But I will say that is something that would have to be included in the budget that the legislature is going to deal with in the regular session. So there is no language that requires in the Constitution that the full cost be covered. That's just based on the assumption that the legislature and the administration would follow through on what they promised. All of that caveat, Daniel, I know you were a supporter of this, so can you talk through your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'll hit the high level points. It's really important that people understand teachers are employees of their local school districts. I believe good teachers should not just make a little more money, they should make a lot more money. And we have the opportunity to do that and have that discussion. The idea that the state should be in that business is crazy. This would be like, one company hires an employee, sets a pay scale, and then we expect another company to come in and pay their employees more. That's not the way this works. Again, teachers are employees of their local school boards, or in the case of charters, their charter boards. That's where compensation decisions get made in every other facet of life, your employer. And so and again, I think if folks out there like Jan are interested in continuing to push, and we would agree with you in many cases, for higher pay for good teachers, that conversation needs to happen at the local school level. Furthermore, the benefit of paying off debt, as Stephen noted, is going to be much greater than the money, quote, lost because of the interest coming out of that was being used to fund essentially $70 million spread across a whole bunch of different school districts and higher ed. The individual money was actually very little. And this actually produces more money that can be spent on that. If that's a priority of legislators in the budget process, they have the ability to do that. Anytime we can pay down debt, that frees up further money for the state general fund, because currently, as Stephen mentioned in his opening, we're spending a lot of money on debt service. We borrowed far too much money, and we can have a whole other hour on pensions. But this is an opportunity to make sure that the proper compensation decisions are made at the right place to help locals pay off debt that benefits both the state, teachers, and local school boards, and set the state up to be successful over the long run. And again, provide actually more money in the state general fund that can be reflected by the spending of legislators.
Barry, please don't go into a deep dive about pensions, but do you have anything you'd like to add to this debate?
I'll be very brief. I will say sometimes good ideas collide. And I think it was a good idea. It's always a good idea to try and pay off a lot of that retirement debt. That's just a smart thing to do. But it was also a good idea to take money that we did get from offshore tobacco and put it into education trust funds that could serve for a long period of time. I think our group feels some of that could have been reformed, but they're both good ideas. And so, so now we have a new approach to those two good ideas colliding.
Okay, and we have one note from somebody who's watching who noted that there will be additional savings for some local school systems beyond what they need to cover the continued pay stipends, making them permanent. So some systems will actually get additional money that they can spend on other things as well. We're going to move on. I think we're going to skip the discussion of reorganization of other trust funds just in the interest of time.
Just go to the PAR guy.
To know what's happening to the other trust funds in the Constitution, I promise you our guide has all of that information for you. And we're going to move to the last section on property taxes.
Yeah, not any big deal to anyone, property taxes. So most important thing with targeting property taxes, it doesn't change the homestead exemption. That's staying there. However, a lot of other exemptions will move into statute. So for most notable is probably the industrial tax exemption program. That will move into statute. The roll forward, roll back millage adjustments roll on to statute. Some things still will be in religious organizations will stay exempt. And they're also the process, the sort of freezing that you have for those over 65 and for those that are disabled. So their assessments, that still stays in the Constitution. However, a lot of other smaller ones are definitely moving out. You would require a 3/4 legislative vote for new property tax exemptions and a 2/3 vote to change the existing ones. And property tax would only be limited to fiscal sessions when they could address it. Then there's a whole other section dealing with the inventory tax. So there is no specific inventory tax. As many of you know, there is a property tax which includes inventory or property for resale later. Now, this gives locals the ability to get rid of their tax on inventory as long as 3 groups agree: the sheriff, the school board, and the parish authority. If they agree, they can eliminate either fairly immediately or over time their tax on inventory. As part of the funding that we talked about for the Revenue Stabilization Fund, there will be money then available to have an incentive payment. So essentially, you take the last 3 years that you're getting, you can get a payment for that with a maximum of $15 million. And we can talk about whether that's enough in the discussion for some for some areas. In addition to all of that, then there's another route to either eliminate or lower tax on inventory. There'll be a separate assessment value in there that locals can lower, which would have the effect of lowering that tax. It's not a tax rate change, but it's sort of a technical way of lowering the taxes, so they can do something in between if they can't afford to get rid of the entire inventory tax, but they can in fact lessen the burden. And again, that would be up to the locals, those 3 groups that I mentioned before. That is a very quick summary of a complicated project, but I think that gets at the heart of what we're looking at. All the property tax changes, plus looking to eliminate, at least in some areas and some parishes, the tax on inventory.
Okay, thank you to everybody who stuck in with us past the hour mark. We really appreciate it. We understand this is difficult. We promise we're in the home stretch. Barry, Tag, you're it. Property taxes. What do you think?
I think this is a pretty good part of the constitutional change. It's not monumental as some of the other things were, but I think what it does, it gives people the protection, which I know they want for the homestead exemption. And, for people over 65, there's a special assessment that kind of remains in the Constitution. But really, we've talked about this a lot, trying to take a lot of those exemptions that are in the Constitution and been added on year after year after we have all these amendments and putting those into statute. Still a high bar to change it, but the legislature can do it. It doesn't have to be a vote of the people. So I think all of that is pretty positive. Stephen mentioned a lot about the inventory tax. We've talked a little bit about it already. It's a tax that, honestly, we're trying to get rid of. We've been looking for ways to do that, but it's a local tax. It's not a state tax, but the state has so much to do over property taxes, and the Constitution does. This doesn't really get rid of any of that yet, but it does provide some mechanisms for that to possibly happen in some areas or some regions. So I think, you take all of that together, those are all pretty positive things that, I think actually are part of what we were talking about trying to streamline the Constitution and get some of those things out of there and give the legislature some flexibility in instances in the future where it may want to exercise that.
Okay, we do have a question about the inventory tax credit. Daniel, can you explain that as you're going through your rationale for your support here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd echo what Barry said. I'll add, I think it's a good thing for parishes to compete with one another. This is, the inventory tax optionality will make it possible. Currently in the Constitution, as you noted, Stephen, it requires the locals to tax inventory in their property tax collections. This gives them the option to do that. I think that's great. The fact that the state is, putting a sweetener to help transition local governments off of that inventory tax for those who choose to do so makes it makes sense to help incentivize that. But over time, I think we're going to see more and more parishes choose to eliminate their inventory tax as we hope more jobs and opportunity and people come to our state because of the changes that we're making. It'll be interesting to see how that stacks up to the parishes who keep their inventory tax. In terms of the credit, my understanding is it's going to phase, in some cases, phase out. It will keep the inventory tax credit for businesses that are paying it, at least for the next few years. And I think that's something the legislature will continue to address, and they'll have the ability to address that. Keep in mind, the way this has worked in the past is the inventory tax is charged by the locals, and then the state rebates to the payers of that tax all or some portion of their tax liability. So really, it's a subsidy of the state to local government, but passed through taxpayers. So it's a particularly inefficient way to to collect and capture tax revenue. So this helps begin the process of streamlining it.
Okay, thank you. Jan, you get the last word on property taxes.
Well, I think this is, I hate to play against type. This is one of the parts that we don't really hate that much. There's some
High
good
praise,
aspects of
high
this.
praise.
Yeah, look,
You waited until like we were done and to put that in there.
Taking the industrial tax exemption program out of the Constitution and some of these other property tax exemptions out of the Constitution and moving them into statute is probably a good idea. I think if I were a local government, I'd be very wary about accepting a one-time payment from the state in order to get rid of a recurring source of revenue. One of the reasons, local governments have two ways to raise money besides fines and fees. It's property taxes and sales taxes. We have very low property taxes in Louisiana, which is one reason we have the highest sales taxes in all of the land in Louisiana. And much of that is charged at the local level. So anytime you start talking about lowering property taxes at the local level, you're either talking about reducing the revenue that's available to pay for police and schools and parks and all the things that local governments pay for, or raising sales taxes because local governments have responsibilities to their constituents as well. But I agree with Daniel that the way we've administered the inventory tax is one of those only in Louisiana, Rube Goldberg contraptions that doesn't work that great. And if there's a way to kind of reform that while still preserving the ability of local governments to raise their own revenue. I mean, if it were up to me, manufacturing corporations would pay more property taxes. We give them a very generous tax exemption, and the legislature will have more flexibility to mandate that if they so choose by taking that tax break out of the Constitution. So there's some good here. It doesn't change how I feel about the entire monstrosity of this amendment, but there's some good stuff in those 109 pages.
All right. So I want to thank everyone, particularly for your patience as we ran a little over time. There's a lot to cover, and for those of you that stayed with us, thank you so much. Hopefully this was useful. I really want to thank all of our panelists and the extra time that they gave us. As always, I personally enjoyed our conversations. It's always great to work with y'all. I want to thank everyone. In addition, also our sponsor, the local pharmacies. I really appreciate that y'all are supporting this type of civic discourse, which I think is great and only adds to Louisiana. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate y'all taking the time.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Par, for doing this.
Thank you.
Good to see
Thank you,
y'all.
Par.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Let's see y'all around.
All right.